10 years on from the onset of the global financial crisis, we're going to join senior investment figures from around the globe for an interactive discussion on the current conditions and possible scenarios in investment markets. Our panel of expert practitioners from RICS's Investment Risk Forum is the core group of people, give and take, who created that landmark report. So what we're seeing are some of the really brain-busting minds who created it, and they're here to present it in people as well. The Risk Forum is the only group of its kind. It brings together chief investment officers and chief risk managers from leading institutional investors who are responsible for more than $1 trillion of real estate assets under management. We're going to sit for a mock investment, well, it's not really mock because you do this for your real life, and we're going to take a quick look. It's a real-life meeting of the forum, members from Europe, the Americas, and Asia Pacific. This forum was established 3 years ago to meet a growing desire amongst investors for a forum dedicated to advancing risk management, thought leadership, and best practice. And all it leaves me to do is to leave it to its chair, Martin Brühl, to introduce everybody and to take it away. Martin.
Thank you so much. Thank you, James, and good afternoon, everybody. Can you just tell the people outside of this room they should come in now, otherwise they will miss a fantastic show. You know, whilst they're coming in, maybe James, just to complete what you just explained to me, the RICS Investment Risk Forum was actually set up during my term as the 134th president of RICS. The theme of my presidency then was responsible investment, not just in the ecological and sustainability sense, but very much in terms of the fiduciary duty that we as investors all have in relationship to our clients. Now, the $1 trillion panel may sound a bit pompous, I must admit, but believe me, we are only humble servants of other people's capital. And against that background, we realized that 10 years on from the global financial crisis, the music is still playing, but some people are beginning to dance a bit closer to the door. And there are legitimate concerns which we as members of the Investment Risk Forum share, that some lessons of the past may have been slightly forgotten, and people who say this time it will be different, they effectively make the same mistakes as people who said in 2005 and 2006 there's a paradigm change. Now, what we've learned around the 3 world regions in which the Investment Risk Forum is meeting regularly is that when people talk about a paradigm change, people should run to the hills. And therefore, we do take our fiduciary duty very seriously. We get together in London, in New York, in Singapore or Hong Kong regularly to share best practice, to exchange thoughts, and to, in a way, try and show some thought leadership, which hopefully will help to underpin financial stability, which is what we all need. I'm delighted that our efforts to gather a whole football team has almost succeeded. I mean, it's rarely that I've chaired a panel with 9 panelists, so it's a bit of a challenge. What the aim was that we would like to gather the combined industry experience of like 250 years. And we reached this with 9 people. We said stop, otherwise it would have been a football team. And I'm delighted, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce to you the members of that panel. I'm going to be starting from your far left with Mr. Eric Cheer from Singapore. Eric is the head of investment management at Union Investment Real Estate. Eric is based in Singapore, has many years of experience, and I'm delighted that you made it over to the World Built Environment Forum today. Right next to him, we have Dr. Russell Chaplin, who until recently was the Chief Investment Officer of Aberdeen Asset Management. And he's now, I mean, in his young age, he's kind of a senior millennial. He's the founder of a startup. and the startup company is called Intrinsic Value Real Estate Advisors, and you will talk about that topic in a second. Thanks for joining us, Russell. We've got, and we're actually doing pretty well in terms of diversity, gender diversity, I think. Where's my predecessor, Louise Brooks-Smith, past president? We're doing well. I look at the mix we have today on that panel. We've got Nadia de Jager. She is Chief Investment Risk Officer based in London, Nadia, with CBRE Global Investors, a big role. And again, we'll hear from her perspective in the day job about risk management today. To my right, we've got Phil Barrett. Phil Barrett did such a great job as Global Chief Risk Officer with PGIM that you were recently promoted, weren't you, to Global Head of Business and Investment Operations. A big job, and delighted that you made the time to be with us today. To my left, a legend, Mark Mogul. Mark has got one big weakness, and I've exploited this ruthlessly. He cannot say no. So when you look into the app and see the bio, Mark is here today because he can't say no, and I'm delighted that you, as Executive Chairman and Chief Investment Officer of Benson Elliott Capital Management, a real estate private equity firm, highly successful, have made it onto this panel. And then to your immediate left, Mark, and to your further right, ladies and gentlemen, we've got Lu Li. Lu Li is the Head of Investment Risk for illiquid assets at Aviva Investors. And next to her, we've got Catherine Pfeifenberger, who's joined us from New York. Catherine is the Senior Vice President for Capital Markets of a very successful Swedish developer, Skanska, but obviously running the operations in the United States. Thanks for joining us. And finally, last but by no means least, we decided that M&G should also be present, dear Tony, and a belated happy birthday to you, 20 years old again. Repeatedly. Tony is the head of M&G Real Estate in the UK, and that completes our 250 years of experience. Let's hope some of that will shine through in the course of the next 70 minutes or so. Okay, right. Now, James, I'm sit down because this is me chairing this, and why would I stand all the time? What we do today, ladies and gentlemen, is we invite you to join. It's a pretty good audience actually for an investment committee. To join our investment committee, we'll be looking at three assets which we are potentially buying, which we could invest in. What we invest in is an existing fund, which I'm going to explain to you in a second. It's a global vehicle which is already established for quite a few years. It's like 10 years old. It's large, it's diversified. We've got a bit more than 10 billion US dollars of assets under management. It's important to note it's open-ended, which means money can actually be flowing out again. So that's a consideration which will come up in our discussions. It is diversified already. It's global, of course. It's the Global Investment Risk Forum, of course, which is dealing with this. It's got a core investment strategy. Some people may find this boring. We'll discuss whether core is risky or not. It can do a bit more risk, like 10% maximum of AUM can be in other spectrums of risk. We can do all assets, all sectors, and the target of the fund really is to beat a global benchmark. We are in the lucky position that there's a long and big queue of money wanting to get into the fund, money that wants to be deployed responsibly in the current real estate market. Our clients pay us to take risk, but the way and the form of how we do take risk, how we debate it, is going to be kind of showcased in front of you this afternoon. And I can see people have come in. It has actually worked, and I think it's a very wise decision. Now, you've seen the fund. You've seen who's going to be on that investment panel. And before we start looking at the three opportunities being presented by three very eager, keen investment managers whose only purpose in life really is to deploy capital and to really sort of have success and be players in the markets, let's just go one step back and think about the experience of the last 10 years since the breakout, I would say, of GFC, and let's discuss what we have done differently. And I would like to start with you, Phil, and please tell us from your day job experience, what have you done to de-risk that global real estate fund that we're talking about today, the World Built Environment Forum Global Real Estate Fund? Over to you.
Thanks, Martin. I think from the survey that we took last year, one of the more better things about it was that 90% of the people who answered the survey said that they are actually spending more in risk management. And from our personal point of view, where I am, we actually set up a separate investment risk group, so a totally independent group to look at all of the transactions and actually carry out biannual portfolio reviews. We set clearer risk parameters around all of the funds that we have, involving often lower leverage and lower allocations to non-core. And then the other thing that we've been doing, certainly as this cycle has continued, is we've looked aggressively at the portfolio and seeing how we can tidy it up by selling some of the underperforming stuff.
Okay. Now, what kind of signs of late cycle behavior do you see in your day job, and what is the conclusion you draw from that?
Yeah, I think we are definitely longer in the cycle. I started work in 1990, and I've seen 4 clear cycles in my career, so that's about every 7 years. So depending upon when you think the recession started or ended, let's say 2012 in Europe or earlier elsewhere, then clearly we are longer in this cycle. I think what we're seeing as a business is increased weight of capital pressing down on all of us to invest. Returns are now normalizing and shrinking back to more normalized levels as cap rate expansion shrinks and it becomes more about income and income creation. And as a result, you see everybody beginning to think style drift is a key issue. People are beginning to chase up the risk curve, looking at more operational assets, more riskier deals. You're starting to see forward purchases of developments under option. And I guess the key question that everyone needs to ask themselves, and we'll ask ourselves today, is this being priced appropriately?
That's a very important point, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Can I just look over to you, Nadia, in terms of de-risking the fund? What is your experience over the last few years?
So over the last few years, we have developed a portfolio risk framework that enables us to actually assess the risk of each portfolio. We roll up various risks, beginning from market risk, property-specific risk, including also the cyclical component and leverage into a metric. And this also enables us to set a risk budget for each portfolio and ensure that these are operated within these risk budgets. In addition to this, in terms of like what we've done to enhance portfolios and reduce the risk is really focusing on income. Income component is incredibly important in real estate, and we have proactively reduced vacancy levels. We looked at our covenant strength of the tenancies and improved that. We have extended lease expiry profile, so all these elements of income have significantly improved, Martin. In addition to that, as I said, leverage is quite important. We monitor it through the framework. Diversification is very important, again, across portfolios to have the right level of diversification, both in terms of geographic allocation, by property type, by vintage. If we partner with different managers, operators, by managers, so just having the right level of diversification is incredibly important, and we closely monitor that. We have also set some governance structures, improved the existing ones, and in addition to that, last and not least, we have improved that prudency and installed more of a prudent culture, especially related to underwriting, because over the last 5 years we had a little bit of tailwind, but that's not what we're expecting in the coming 5 years or so.
Okay, so more discipline, if you like.
Much more disciplined approach and governance structures. For instance, we have independent members on all investment committees. For that, we have a specific investment committee that approves new debt that is then separated from approval of investments. So just to give that enough, space and room and DD, proper due diligence just for debt, new debt approvals.
Okay, thank you. Can I just look at you, Mark? Some of the things people refer to when they say this time things are different is the lower level of debt in the system. Can you confirm that? And what role? Because some people would argue, well, there may be less debt, but there's also the shadow banking sector, which is a potential threat to financial stability. What is your view there?
There is definitely less debt in the system this time than there was last time. And in that sense, simply because what causes the cycle to turn will likely be different than what caused the cycle to turn last time, doesn't mean the cycle won't turn. It'll be an equity-driven turn. It'll be a sentiment-driven turn. The analogy I use with my own staff is if someone yells fire in a cinema and there's only one door to get out, people don't sit around discussing how big their overdraft is on their credit cards before they run for the door. When the market takes the view as a group, when the prevailing view becomes that the risk of not selling is no longer that your asset is worth more tomorrow or the same, and that indeed that prices are likely to trend lower, it is that mass behavior that will ultimately trigger the turn in the cycle. So it doesn't need to be debt. So simply because, in answer to your first question, we don't have as much debt in the system doesn't mean that we should go to sleep at night thinking that the cycle won't turn. What does give, and certainly it's factors like the whole treatment of Basel III and, for banks around the globe that's had an impact on that. For those who are in the UK, they'll be very familiar with the slotting regime, and that has kept the banks well under control. There are sources of capital that have moved into debt financing to make up for that. If you have an opportunity, someone's going to fill that opportunity. And in this case, it has been debt funds around the globe. To some extent, it's been insurers and other fund managers. But today, the concern, and this is, if you will, wearing the Bank of England hat, is, again, this view that simply because that those debt funds tend to be backed by institutional investors, we don't need to worry at all about that risk exposure. That's really not accurate. The concern that one has to have is what is the correlation between the investment goals, views, outlook for all of the investors in those debt funds, because most of them are closed-end funds, and ultimately those funds are going to have to be redeemed. And most loans do not actually get paid off by a sale of the asset. They get paid off by a refinancing. And so there is built into the system today a fairly significant refinancing risk that we don't talk a lot about, but because as long as it's not a problem, we don't need to talk about it. But it is there, and combine that with the fact that a lot of those funds are increasingly chasing a relatively small amount of transactions because transaction volumes are down in general. The money raised for those strategies is up. And so there is a bit of a disconnect to start with between what the investors have been pitched in terms of what's going to be in those funds and what actually those funds are seeing available. So it's an area to keep an eye on without being at this stage an area of great concern. That's the way I would put it.
But to say there is less debt in the system is just half the picture.
Correct.
There is refinancing redemption risk really in the system built in as well. Can I turn to our senior millennial, Russell? Russell, you've been dealing with investment risks for many years in your career. What's your experience since the outbreak of GFC?
Yeah, sure. So I think, I'd echo what's been said already in terms of a greater focus on investment risk across the board, I would say, across the industry. I did want to pick up on one of the things you said in the introduction about, clients pay us to take risk. And I'm not sure that's true. I think clients pay us to make investments. And I think that that's slightly different to clients paying us to take risk. So, for me, an investment is a bundle of risks, and you have to work out whether that bundle of risks and the price that you're going to pay for that set of risks is appropriate or not. So it's about the pricing of those risks, not just understanding the risks. You've got to understand the risks first. Then you've got to work out whether the price is right, and then that leads on to whether it's an investment or not. And the framework that I've used to do that for the last 10 years or so is to relate that price and the pricing of those risks back to what's called intrinsic value. So what is that bundle of risks actually worth? And are you paying too much for that bundle of risks, or too little, or is it around fairly priced? You're never going to get this exactly right, but some estimate of what this investment is potentially worth in the long term, because as we all know, the market goes up and down. It's more volatile than it should be. And so that intrinsic value gives you an anchor to work with to try and establish some discipline in terms of pricing, because it's not just risks which are risks, pricing is a risk as well. So you have to think about the pricing of the assets too.
Thank you. And by the way, can I just say I'm really impressed by the simultaneous translators doing the Chinese translation of what we talk about here. So thumbs up, and don't faint before the end of this session, please. There you go. That was quick. The whole Chinese delegation was clapping immediately. That's a good sign, actually, for...
It's working.
It's working, yeah.
It was a delay from what I said, Martin.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It was your applause. Yeah.
Clapping at him, yeah.
Right, now back to serious business, ladies and gentlemen. Excuse me, here I'm chairing an investment committee here, and this is not serious enough. Can I now invite the three investment managers to present one by one their particular investment proposal? Can I ask you to be brief, concise, and can I also, ladies and gentlemen, ask you to watch very carefully, because I'm going to ask you a few questions, of course, during the session in terms of what your preference would be and how you interpret the various categories of risks that may be crystallized here when we present the three cases. So the first one, can I just say that any resemblance to properties, living or dead, is purely coincidental today. This is like a mock investment committee with imaginary properties. But one is pretty good looking behind us here. That's a building that Eric Cheer from Singapore is going to present to us today. And please watch.
Yeah. What I would say is this is the ideal core investment. Starting off its geography. So geographically, Singapore, one of the top-rated cities around the world. It's an attractive place to be. So that in itself is great. It's well located, 2 minutes walk from a train station. Again, like a plus. If you go back to old school real estate, location, 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 this is what we've got. Then we talk about the quality of this building. This is a desirable building. It's a building that is high quality in its construction. It's a building that is also, it's quite mature in its income stream. It's multi-tenanted. It's stabilized in its occupancy. One thing that we do have to be objective about, though, apart from all these wonderful qualities that I've said, is that it does have some more Singaporean-specific risks that come with it. And two of those things that would be worthwhile highlighting. One is that it has a high level of income volatility, partially because of the WALE, or the weighted average length of its expiry. So typically leases are 2 to 3 years, which some of you may not be as comfortable with. But this is a local market practice. And the other one is that what we have in Singapore is a level of, or the potential for political policy risk. And this is what we define by being the government has the ability to increase supply of land, with the view of trying to control the cost of doing business in Singapore. That's the pitch.
That's the pitch. Yeah, I've never heard you be so modest about when you pitch for acquisitions. It's good exercise. Yeah. Now, how big do you think the risk of a supply shock really is in that particular market? I mean, you're presenting a core asset. I mean, did you mention price returns figures? And
so in quantum, just to put sort of in terms of the risk to your allocation, it would be just under $400 million US dollars in size. In terms of a metric, probably like less than $170 US dollars per square meter. In terms of cap rate, roughly between 3 to 3.5%. That's kind of the pricing metrics that go with that. But when it comes to the potential sort of income challenges, which we talked about the supply, this is one where if you look out the window of Marina Bay Financial Centre, of the existing buildings that are there, you'll actually see very neatly parceled out blocks of land. They're ready to go. Anytime there is sort of the demand, those can actually be offered out to developers. And Singapore is one where developers are fundamentally speculative. They tend to develop when they want to develop, where they see an opportunity in the future. So that's kind of where that risk historically has been proven to be one to consider.
Thank you. Now, can I turn to Lou? I don't know whether people will remember when our wonderful president of RSS, John Hughes, this morning gave his opening address. He said that climate change is making the world, what did he say, hotter, wetter, and wilder. I like that. Climate change makes the world hotter, wetter, and wilder. Now, this is a coastal city, Lou. Now, do you think we should even consider this property, or should we really dig into the resilience of the asset to hydrological or meteorological shocks for this investment decision?
Thanks, Martin. The short answer is absolutely. I think that should be one of the key considerations for institutional investor, especially over a long-term type of investment. And if we think about Singapore, it's a very typical low-lying tropical island and with a very high density of population. So due to its low elevation, and it's more vulnerable to this type of climate change and hydrological shocks, which could cause serious injuries and also physical damage to the building we're looking at. Actually, I was on a business trip to Singapore last year, end of September, and during my stay there, and every day was over 30 degrees. I live in London, so I was loving this hot weather when I was in Asia. But on the other side, it's a bit worrying because it could be a potential indicator as a long-term temperature rise for Singapore due to global warming and climate change. And also there's forecast of the sea level raising up to 1 meter by 2100, which is like 82 years away from now, which is not that far. But what I learned that across the Singapore market is that the government actually has been quite proactive managing these potential issues, that for development at certain scale that they have to build on-site measurements, for example, like detention tanks. And also when I was in Singapore, I was quite impressed to see lots of buildings are fully covered by plants. That's because they were required to build in green roofs. Also, I think the government is very, very strict in terms of the level of entrance for the basement as well as underground facilities, and there is a minimum requirement of the height for the general ground level. So, I mean, this building we're looking at, given the fact that it's got a Green Mark Platinum rated for energy efficiency, that give me a certain level of comfort that not just comply with the government regulation, and the developers is probably taking into account of sustainability measures seriously. Also, I think the key question to ask ourselves is that how is this building going to be affected by extreme weather conditions, hydrological shocks, sea level rise, and increase of rainfalls? And we need to satisfy ourselves that we have the ability to manage and mitigate this investment risk that we are potentially exposed to when we are making this investment decision.
Okay. So maybe something which you need to place a focus on in due diligence should we really decide to go for this investment. By the way, I should have mentioned, ladies and gentlemen, we can only do one of the three which we're going to look at today. So that's the bit of a challenge, the intellectual challenge. One of the three we can only do. And before we move on to the next one, I just looked into my figures. Researchers have given me figures that in our kind of just shy of $11 billion fund, we've got 23.876% in coastal areas. And when I hear Lou about the sea level rise, should we maybe, Phil, from a top-down portfolio construction level, not impose a limit on what we're going to invest in terms of coastal areas?
3.875%.
That should be enough, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, but what's your view?
I think the challenge you face with that, Martin, as you know, is that the biggest investable universe in the world is America, and frankly, the place you want to invest in America is effectively the smile, as we always say in our shop, and that puts you on the coast. So I think it's hard for you to decide that you're not going to invest in the coast. I think you have to look at other mitigating factors, such as actually where you are. Let's get the 1 in 100-year flood data, let's get the information, and let's make sure we buy good insurance. Okay, good. Buy good insurance. That's one way to solve the issue.
Would you buy an office block on the River Thames? I mean, on the
Yeah, I think one of the more scary statistics about London is the barrier's not very far from here if you want to go and have a look at it. And when it was originally built, I think, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but I think the intention was that they were going to raise the barrier about 5 times a year, and I think they raise it something like 290 days a year now to try and calm down the tide. So I think you have to be cognizant of that, and I think you have to pay attention. The reality is the highest value real estate in London is often the stuff that's right by the water because it has the best views.
Yeah, I mean, Catherine, you've done a lot of development in Boston, for example. I mean, you have invested heavily in the coastal markets. Do you think this is a safe bet going forward, or do you take particular precautions in the way you construct your assets?
Well, I mean, clearly you have to think a lot more about how you're developing in terms of the building design, how you're building your neighborhoods, where the mechanicals are. But I mean, clearly there's been a lot more storms, and I think one of the things we're also looking at is, I mean, the cost of insurance continues to go up, and I mean, it's getting very expensive as there are more storms around the country and all the coastal cities. So I think, we're also looking at operating expenses and safety. So it's all about the occupiers. So when you're building, where are people, what is the reaction? And so thinking about developing the building, I mean, there's a lot more being done to protect those areas of the cities, but it's still a challenge, and I think there's still exposure.
Okay, thank you. Now, we've heard that the Thames Barrier is working 270 days a year, so let's not therefore stop investing in London. Tony, can I call upon you? You have an interesting investment proposition to make today.
Yes, thank you. Hopefully you'll get the photo coming up.
Coming up, 1 second. Here we go.
No,
that's one
second one. So this is in London, in West London. It's nowhere near the river. and it's not as hot as Singapore, although this weekend it was pretty nice in London. But this is an opportunity to acquire a purpose-built residential rental block of accommodation for £150 million. The income yield is 4%, and the expected returns are 8 to 10% over the next 5 years. So this particular block was completed last year, so it's reasonably modern. There are 300 apartments, all of which are being leased to private individuals on assured short-hold tenancies. The target customer here is the young professional market. The average salary to afford one of these flats is about £30,000 a year. So for young professionals, I think it's quite affordable accommodation, but it's close to sources of work. It's right next door to the Central Line tube station in Zone 3. So for those people who want to access the West End or the City for work, there's a regular train service in peak hour every 2 to 3 minutes. There's a mixture of 1, 2 and 3 bedroom accommodation, so it suits a variety of needs for different households. The accessibility is really good with the Central Line, but it's also improving. The Crossrail station will be quite close to this development. In about a year's time, it'll be 500 metres from a new Crossrail station, which will open up east-west and west-east communications across London a lot faster and a lot more efficiently, particularly linking to Heathrow Airport a lot more quickly, which is obviously an attractive thing for our customers who are renting these flats. Within the block of accommodation, not only do you get your flat, you also get access to communal areas as well. So here we've been providing rooftop allotments, for example, so you can do your gardening while you're here. We have a gym, we have a barbecue area, we also have an internal dining area which you can hire out, and we also have the free use of an electric car for 4 hours at a time, which you can book out through the concierge. So there's a whole series of services we're providing here, and the idea is to really create a sense of community, which from an investment perspective will create longer term returns. People will stay in their flats for longer and pay higher rents over time because of the sense of community that's created by those communal services. The particular area in West London where this is, it's a really nice area, but it's improving. There's more restaurants now than there was in the past. There's a number of bars and shops in the local area. And we actually targeted this particular location not only through our traditional research, but we also use artificial intelligence to pinpoint this particular location. So we used AI to basically use 10,000 data points every 200 meters within this particular location to find the best potential spot to develop a block of flats. And those data points are things like social media, so Twitter feeds, restaurant reviews and so on, to really find out what's it really like to actually live in this particular location. So that's the actual investment. In terms of the sector itself, the residential sector in the UK in terms of rental is fairly new for institutional investors, but it's growing all the time. We expect it to grow in a similar way to the US, where currently about 25% of commercial investment by institutions in the US is into what's called the multifamily sector, which is what this investment is itself. So we think over time, more investors will go into this space, which will drive higher prices, which is good for our investment here today. And the reason we think more investors will go into it is because the fundamentals of supply and demand in the housing market in the UK are really strong for investors. About 20% of households today are in private rented accommodation, compared to only 9% 25 years ago. There were 4 million households renting today and only 1.7 million 10 years ago. So we're seeing a massive increase in the amount of people who are choosing to rent accommodation, which is obviously good for driving rental returns from these types of accommodation. So therefore, in summary, this investment really provides our particular business with an opportunity to invest in a sector that's got really strong fundamentals. We've got a chronic housing shortage in the UK. We'll deliver strong, low-risk returns, but also provide an element of social value creation as well by creating really good quality, professionally managed accommodation for the people who are choosing to live in this apartment block. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Now, I can just see on people's minds, especially those who are not from the UK, and I'm sure there's a term which doesn't even need to be translated into Chinese, Brexit, Mark. Brexit has recently been defined, and I've read this, I have to read this out, this is fantastic. Brexit is the undefined, being negotiated by the unprepared in order to get the unspecified for the uninformed. Not bad, huh? Now, against that background, I mean, if this is only half true, Mark, I mean, could you possibly recommend that we should invest in the UK in this particular situation?
Let me start by saying that most of the investors in this asset class are domestic investors. So let's put that to one side. They've got to get comfortable or they got to leave. But if you would ask me the question, which I think really is underneath what you're asking me, is what's going on with the foreign investor view with Brexit. It's an interesting question, and it's something that we spend a lot of time looking at from the bank's perspective, because everybody on this dais will be aware that the share of property investment in the UK attributable to foreign investors has grown steadily in recent years, and indeed is a clear majority of the total invested in the sector today. Also implicit in your question is, should the concerns over or the uncertainty surrounding Brexit be off-putting to the foreign investor? Well, all risks are relative, and what you're alluding to are what we refer to as pull factors. Equally powerful are what we refer to as push factors. And if you look at where the capital is coming into the UK from today, it's interesting that there's comparatively less capital coming from Europe than historically has been the case. Interestingly, your comfort with Brexit seems to be greater the further away from the UK you find yourself. But the flow of capital coming in from Asia, the Middle East, is certainly sufficient, given transaction volumes today, to replace any reduction in capital from other markets. With that said, and we look at the overseas investor markets as breaking them down not by geography, but two types of investors: institutional and non-institutional investors. Institutional investors tend to look through politics. They are focused on what they think the long-term outlook is for any market, and I've had them in front of our panels inside the bank extensively. And whilst they're not happy with Brexit, whilst they are clear on the short-term impact to growth, there is a prevailing view that London is a global city. This is a London asset we're talking about, and they are looking through that and still have an appetite for investment in London. If you look at the non-institutional side, early on we actually saw an enthusiasm to buy cheap sterling. That is not a factor from the institutions in general, but many of them look at the challenges or the threats in the markets in their home markets, and are pretty comfortable by comparison coming into the UK market. So in short, would I rule out this investment because of the Brexit perspective? I would say, and I know we're going to come on to it later at some point, that right now the bigger concern for most of the people that I speak to at this stage, I'd say from a Brexit fear perspective, we've reached max Brexit fear. We're kind of coming out the other end on that one. We're moving into growing Corbyn risk fear. And we can talk about that one when it's appropriate.
You know what? It's now. It's appropriate because, I mean, Tony, I see from your paper, normally paperless, but for this panel I'm using paper, which I can't find. I see you have got an initial income yield of 4%, correct? And you kind of present this with a total return over 5 years of up to 10%. You must have built an enormous amount of rental growth in this model.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So what happens to your rental growth assumptions if there's a change of government in form?
Sorry,
Well, I think if there's a change of government, and I guess what you're alluding to is maybe the potential for a Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour government at the next general election, there are also implications for all types of commercial real estate and residential as well. I think that in reality, though, residential is a major asset class across Europe, and in many cities across Europe there are restrictions on rental levels. So there's a possibility that rental growth may be restricted to some degree under a Labour government, but we've seen strong demand still from investors for cities across Europe where those rental restrictions still apply. So it may dampen some of the rental growth, but it doesn't change the fundamentals of the supply and demand or shortage of housing within London, particularly in accessible locations like this.
Okay. The interesting thing is when in Germany, like 20 years ago, state-owned housing stock was privatized, everybody looked at the UK and looked at the high home ownership rates which were in place since kind of the Thatcher government in the 80s. Now you are saying that there's more PRS, private rental sector investment coming up because more people rent now instead of going up the housing ladder. Sometimes they fall off the ladder as well, as we've seen in the last crisis. Now, would it therefore be fair to say that this is like an alternative investment? And we mentioned earlier there's a drive to more operational risk and alternatives. Phil, what's your view? I mean, is alternatives the flavor of the month, such as the PRS presented here from Tony?
Yeah, I think it's very clear. One of the clear trends you've seen in the last 3 or 4 years across investments pretty much anywhere in the world actually is an increasing share of investments being undertaken in what we call alternatives. And personally, I've actually invested in things as esoteric as self-storage, senior housing and student housing accommodation. And I think the concern that I always have that I put to people when they think about this, and especially in residential where it's all about the gross to net dilution on how efficiently your operator actually operates the asset, is really to understand who your operator is and who's actually doing it and what they do. And a couple of stories just to maybe illustrate the operational risk of this. I was chairman of a very large listed UK self-storage business for many years, and we used to spend all of our time not talking about real estate, but this is going back some time by the way, but talking about the how we were going to make sure that we were mobile enabled for being able to sell our storage units to our customers at the time of the big shift from internet to mobile. And that was most of the conversation at the board table. It was nothing to do with real estate. And then my other favourite story about operational assets that can show you how things can potentially go wrong was back in '99, the government introduced minimum wage. A very good friend of mine was the largest owner of senior care in the UK, who in the space of about 6 months became the largest operator and owner of senior care in the UK. And he famously told me of the story where the operator phoned up and said, I've got 67 old people, I've just fed them breakfast, I've left the keys to the front door on the desk, and they need tea at 3 o'clock. And this person was based in London. So I think you have to kind of watch the operational risk bit here, you have to watch your operators, you have to know what you're doing. And I can't help feeling that a lot of people sometimes underestimate the operational risk in some of these emerging asset classes.
That's a good point. Russell, in your intrinsic value model, how do you deal with that operational risk, which arguably can be mispriced in today's environment?
Yeah, I mean, these are difficult things to untangle, right, across the board, not just in terms of residential. I think in the good old days we used to call this obsolescence and depreciation and so on. And I think this is one of the factors that we're seeing coming back and maybe has been forgotten about a little bit during the last cycle. Yeah. Because everything's been going up for such a long time. I think there's Nassim Nicholas Taleb says that reality is very cruel in that it's like playing Russian roulette, but the revolver has 1,000 potential shots in it, but only one bullet. And after a while, you forget that there's any bullet in it after you've pulled the trigger so many times and nothing's happened. So we seem to be in that kind of situation at the moment, and you maybe forget about these operational risks, how they impact on the depreciation of the asset. And these are kind of things we've been talking about for over 35 years and haven't still, I think, probably got a very good handle on. So it's, again, when you're thinking about the risk premia and how you build that up and think about the pricing of the asset and its actual fundamental intrinsic value, it has to be taken into account in there. It's a great deal of uncertainty, though. We don't know how those things will play out.
Okay. Well, this is the challenge that we face today together in deciding which asset we're going to invest in. And can I now call upon Catherine, please? You have one interesting case in Seattle, I believe, to present to us. Here we go.
All right, thanks. So this is a new LEED Platinum tower delivering in 2018 in the core CBD of Seattle, Washington. Tower's about 700,000 square feet. It's owned fee simple. As you know, Seattle is a pretty vibrant, growing economy, a great place to live. The amenity package in this office tower was designed with the occupants in mind. So it's in a location that's very walkable. It has a lot of bike access and bike storage. It, of course, has Tesla charging stations, as we heard this morning was key to survival. It has a great roof deck with water views that are protected since no one can build in front of them. It has a floor of conference facilities and a gym. And I think the one thing we see all of our tenants looking for these days is amenities and the amenity space. So there is a 3-story lobby that the center is a Spanish Steps with a market hall around it, with the idea of connecting the building to the neighborhood and becoming part of that neighborhood. It also has a building management system as well, with a dashboard that monitors energy and use, water use, everything in the building. From a tenant perspective, it is leased, 70% of the leasing activity is for Amazon, which has a 15-year lease. Their lease has a 2.75% bump every year. WeWork has the other 25% of the building with a 7-year lease with a similar 2.75% increase every year. And then the remaining 5% is the retail space on the ground floor, which is all locally owned small retail operators. So the purchase price on the building, since it's a tower, is about $730 million at a 4.1% cap rate, which equates to just over $1,000 a square foot. I think Martin's question was going to be, what's the annual? On an annual basis, the rent really is, I mean, you're pretty much locked in on the space except for increases in parking income and retail income. So it'd be about 5% per year. I guess the real question is, what's the appreciation in 5 years? So much more challenging question. There haven't been buildings selling at $1,000 a square foot in Seattle until this month, which is closer to where San Francisco and Boston are now trading. And I mean, we sold a building in Seattle 24 months ago, and it was $750 a foot, and it was a brand new building. So that's pretty huge appreciation in 2 years. The question is, how much depreciation do you think is going forward in the next 5 years? And clearly, a lot of that appreciation was happening before, I think, rental rates on the office side was accelerating at the same pace. So now rents are actually growing, and there is, real net absorption and growth in the economy, not just musical chairs of tenants, but there's been a lot of value priced into the building.
Okay, thank you. We had this wonderful panel just before we came on stage, talking about anticipating and harnessing disruptive change. And when I look at this building, Mark, I mean, it's a building full of tech tenants, let's face it, and retailers, I mean, does it not have disruption all over written on the facade? What's your view on that?
Well, it's not full of tech tenants, it's full of tech tenant. And if I were going to choose a tenant on a 15-year lease, I can do an awful lot worse than Amazon. This is a company that's demonstrated it knows how to reinvent itself. So I don't think that is something that would give me huge concern. If I'm wrong in the sense that if that tenant doesn't survive the length of their lease, I'd want to make a judgment on the locational quality, remembering always whenever we buy a building, and it comes back to Russell's point on obsolescence, If we get back to the theory of real estate, it's the land that's appreciating, it's the building that's depreciating. So if I've got a better piece of dirt, then I've got a little bit of protection there. But I look at this building and I see an anchor tenant that's good credit, 15 years, 75%, with that 25% having a little bit of pizzazz to it through the WeWork covenant, WeWork presence, which, look, may or may not work. We can talk about that, as a separate issue, but I think it probably brings a little bit of a buzz to the building. And if things go one way, it's the future expansion space for Amazon. If they go another way and Amazon decides that they've tired of the building after 7 years, but the WeWork experience works, potentially they take over the property. We've seen them buying a lot of real estate lately. I think the retail is such a tiny portion of the overall cash flow exposure. My guess is that you'd characterize it as being all local. That brings with it some authenticity, right? The millennials like that. It's not a bunch of multiples, and presumably, if you've got a building filled with however many thousands of employees this one's got, there's enough to keep turning that retail space and keep it let, because it's today you either need to be ticking the box on convenience or dominance, it seems like, on retail to make it work. Convenience or dominance, and this certainly ticks the convenience box. So, there could be technological disruption, but that 15-year lease to that Amazon covenant, I'll sleep a little better with that.
Okay. Lou, do you have any view on that, on the tech tenant issue and the credit which goes with that at times?
I think when I'm looking at this investment, and this linked to one of the points Nadia mentioned at the beginning, that what is actually our risk appetite in terms of the risk we're taking on in terms of tenant concentration and sector concentration. I think the options are, you either feel you want a diversified portfolio because you don't know where the business could potentially go into, if the WeWork going to work or WeWork is not going to work, or where Amazon is going to be in 10 years' time, because we're looking at long-term investment for a large fund with a long history. And or the other option is, if we do feel we have the risk appetite to taking on some concentration in this building with this tech tenant, then it's important that you understand the tenant's business model, understand the market trend in this sector they operate in, and make sure you are alert to what's happening and manage these potential risks, and proactively. That's one way to kind of taking on board.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm still not really convinced about this asset. I mean, we heard earlier this afternoon in this room that quite rightly so, WeWork is now the largest tenant in the city of London. Now, there is a tendency, it seems, to shorten the lease. When I studied and lived in the UK many years ago, we had the 25-year institutional lease, upward-only rent reviews, FRI, full repair insuring, and privity of contract, so it was a safe bet. This has clearly changed. Russell, what's this transition all about to shorter, more flexible leases? Is this going to be a threat to our core fund strategy?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I tend not to think about lease length as much as I do about the durability of the income. So the durability, to me, is the most important thing. So, and it's not necessarily a question to me about who is the current tenant. It's who might be the next tenant. As we think across the different sectors, having a lease which may be 6 months long in the residential sector in the UK actually may be a very durable income stream. You may have very low or no vacancy. The potential for growth might actually be very high. But it does mean that you need to think about the pricing of that slightly differently than you would to a guaranteed 25-year lease. And all of these factors put a pressure on risk going up across the board, I think, in real estate. Although I think having sat and been educated in the UK, we've had a very comfortable environment with very long leases for a long time. Coming from Singapore, 2 or 3 years, Scandinavia, 2 or 3 years. This is absolutely the norm. So I think it can be priced in. It's much more about the durability. It's much more about thinking, long term, who is the next tenant going to be if this tenant goes? And that then comes back to the fundamentals of where is this building, and are other people going to want to take that space?
Can I add a comment?
Please, please.
Our business makes a business of feeding on the mismanagement of core assets by core investors, right? That's why we exist. And I think this whole shortening of leases across the markets in which we invest, whilst I agree with what Russell just said, it does throw down a challenge to the core industry, because the core industry has to change how it manages its assets. It is not business as usual. What concerns me about the core industry is the pressure, the relentless pressure there's been on fees, and what the implications of that are on staffing levels, P&L pressures, because it doesn't have to be a problem, as Russell says. It can be an opportunity as long as you have the resources to actually ensure that it's not a problem and that you can make it an opportunity.
I mean, this is interesting. I mean, the UK has certainly come down from the 25-year lease to a much shorter environment, and with more also need to have quality asset management in place. You can't just buy it and leave it there for 25 years. That's certainly true. Eric, your example, your property you were presenting in Singapore was clearly a shiny core asset, and in a way competing with Catherine's asset here in Seattle. But you are used to shorter leases, 2 or 3 years, and when you invest in Japan, in Tokyo, for example, there is no such thing as a 10-year lease. So how do you deal with that risk there?
Well, the first thing in sort of comparison is my hedging costs are going to be lower.
The hedging costs are going to be lower, but that's not the intrinsic feature of the asset. That's just luck.
Yeah, but in terms of the asset, I mean, this is a multi-tenanted asset, so that's also a big distinction already, and particularly when you've got shorter leases. It's a double-edged sword, because you have both the potential for quick positive reversion. You can actually grow with the market quickly, and you can adapt and take the benefit of the upside. But at the same time, you can go down with the market too very quickly. So there is that potential. But if you compare on a long leased asset with a single tenant, you've got to sort of consider that, well, every year that lease depletes, your valuation should go down with that as well. So there's kind of a more stabilized valuation that you'll get with a multi-tenanted, short-leased asset potentially, in comparison to a long-whaled asset.
Okay, yeah. This is, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, normally the time in our investment committee sessions where the brandy gets served and alcohol is brought in, because our concentration span wouldn't be that long. But this is just leading by example, water. Now, can I just ask the panel? I mean, we've seen these two core investments, and obviously, I mean, even Tony's PRS asset is, if you like, core, although with some operational risk. Core has seen such tremendous cap rate compression in this cycle. Is it wise to continue on that core strategy? Is core even maybe even riskier than core plus, or even value add, if you like, given where pricing has currently arrived at? Who wants to go first? Who wants to go first? Russell, please. Yes.
Yeah. I think that's a common view. But ultimately, I think these are just labels that have been attached. And people have tried to put together certain risks and build a framework and come up with some labels. I tend to look across the whole spectrum, and it's, again, for me, it's about the pricing of the risk. It's not the risks themselves. And it doesn't matter whether it's labeled as core, value add, opportunistic, core plus, or as one of my friends at UBS used to call it, core but. In that it's core, but it's not got this, or core, but it's not got that. That then comes back to just assessing those underlying risks, trying to work out what those risks are, uncovering all of those, pricing all of those, and then a comparison. It doesn't come down to something as simple as core's expensive or value adds cheap or whatever it may be. And I think one of the critical things that people in real estate tend to get caught up in is that because core is expensive, it doesn't make value add cheap. Yeah, in the same way that because bonds are expensive.
Note down, please. It's a very good line.
In the same way, if bonds are expensive, it doesn't make equities cheap. You have to appraise them for their own risks and work out whether of themselves are they cheap, expensive, fair value.
Thank you. Mark, quick comment on the core pricing.
I think your view on this at some level comes down to, historically, core was buying duration at some level, right? You're buying long leases, you're buying duration. And so I guess it comes down to what is your view on owning duration risk at this point at some level? I think Eric's point is really an interesting one, which is, in a way, by going with shorter leases, you're unwinding some of that duration risk. But it really, at its root, is are you in the school that believes that today's very low yields for the highest quality properties are a product of artificial monetary policy around the world, or do you believe that today's very low yields for the best quality properties are a product of a surfeit of liquidity in the equity markets for our sector that is actually indeed independent of that at some level, whether it's deflationary forces, whether it's the surplus of savings around the world, whatever. And where you come out on that debate will ultimately determine how fearful you are of some kind of mean reversion in yields, and whether this time the snapback potentially might be greater than what we've seen in the past. Because of course, if a perpetual bond yielding 2% sees a 100 basis point uplift in yield, that's a whole lot more painful than a 9% yielding perpetual bond that sees a 100 basis point uplift in yield. So I think there's a kind of a macro overlay that you've got to think about on this question and ask yourself, where do you sit on it?
Sure. Now, this is the moment, ladies and gentlemen, I'm actually impressed. There was very few people looking into their smartphones during this session so far. Now you're allowed to, because I'm going to ask you to give us some steer in the investment committee decision. Now, you remember we've got the three different investments that we've presented to you. We have, I think that became clear during the discussion of the committee, crystallized a number of risks in the course of the three presentations. And if you look at them, it's a policy, a political risk. We've got climate change. We've discussed market risk in a way. We talked about cap rate, compression and decompression. We've certainly touched on technological disruption. And touched on the operational risk with a beautiful anecdotes which Phil Barrett was sharing with us. Of course, this is all secret. Chatham House rules, don't tweet, and therefore it's going to stay in the room. Now, I was going to ask you to actually open your app, which you've used so many times beautifully today. I know, Mark, you can't operate an app, but I show you whilst I'm doing this for the audience. So this is really the app. You go on program, and you then look for our session, which is the $1 trillion question. And if you then scroll down, and when I say you, I mean you, ladies and gentlemen, as well, you find the question to the audience about risk. And if you could just please tell me and tell the panel here, because we're going to make an important, responsible decision, potentially with your money. Tell us what risks we should focus most on in taking that decision right now. So if you want to vote now, we're not going to see the results immediately. Just you do this. I'm going to do it myself. Or do you want to, Mark, do you want to press a button? You know how to press on a touch screen?
It's not like my BlackBerry.
Oh gosh, it's no commercial here. This is just press any risk, please.
Okay, got it.
It's all risky. Thank you so much indeed. I think that's done. And this result, and this is a guidance to us in the investment committee. I would like to, now we have to complete, and then we leave the questionnaire. Now, can we see the result of that one, just to give us some guidance? Oh, look at that. Look at that. Okay. Oh, this is still moving. It's still moving. It's moving because people are pressing on their.
Okay, got it.
It's 1,200 people pressing and giving us guidance. Okay. Okay, listen, guys. I think the market we should not lose out of sight here, definitely. But interesting that policy and technology are considered to be equally risky. Are you guys removing your votes? Do you want to confuse us or what? Just okay. Everybody, hands off. Okay. So that's interesting guidance. And can I then please go back to the voting slide number 1? Thank you. I'm pressing here. No, hold on. Funny thing is, am I pressing or is somebody in the technics department pressing? So I do it. I'm the boss. I'm the chair. Here we go. Now, we would like you to vote. You've heard the 3 presentations, you heard the engaged discussion we had. I mean, obviously this is only a fraction of what we normally do in investment committee when it comes to investments of that magnitude, but you've heard us consider this. We would like you to tell us which of these assets, or even none of them, you would buy for the WBEF, World Built Environment Forum Global Real Estate Fund. Remember, $1 billion of entry queue. They all want us to deploy their capital wisely, responsibly, profitably. So you can vote now. We're not going to look at this because I'm going to ask whilst you're doing it. I trust you. I have to do it. Mark, would you please vote, please, on this one here?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, you do.
I know how to do it now.
Yeah, that's cool. Huh?
What does Fertigstellen mean?
Sorry?
Fertigstellen?
Fertigstellen. This is the German version of the app. By the way, the app is a great invention here. Finish, complete. Fertigstellen. Okay. Next time, can we have a simultaneous translation for German app as well? Good. Right. So we don't know what the audience have actually sort of voted for, but let's just look into who's voting for. Of course, Eric, you would be for the Singapore asset here, please. Can I just have show of hands? The Singapore shiny core assets. That's 3. Okay, 3 out of 9. Only 1 vote allowed, of course, not needless to say. Now, who would like to follow Tony into the private rented sector adventure in the UK? That's 1, 2, 3. No. No. This comes from not preparing everything for a panel. This comes from leaving a bit of a spontaneity. And now, who's going to vote for the Seattle office? I should have prepared this. So shall we? And nobody's going for none of the above because we have pressure to invest. I mean, just think of the alternative of having liquidity lying around on a European bank account, for example, at 0 interest, if not even negative. Negative, correct. Thank you, Mark. So shall we see the results, please, of what the audience have come up, because they seem to be a bit wiser. Here we go. The Seattle office. That's interesting. Now, Mark, why your choice? Can you just explain what your reasoning is of choosing Seattle?
No, choosing PRS.
PRS, thank you.
Because I think we are past peak Brexit concerns. I think that Corbyn, look, you've had rent controls in some of the most significant rental markets around the world, and people have figured out how to work within them. So I can get comfortable with those risks. And I look at the resi space in London, and fundamentally, it is impossible for all those millennials to buy housing today. You talked about this appealing to a 30,000 income tenant. You'd need 3 times that to put a down payment on a house today. We're at the beginning, or a home, forget about a house, a home, a flat. And we're at the beginning of an interest rate tightening cycle in the UK, which is just going to make it even less possible for people to take on a mortgage. My biggest concern about the resi is what Russell talked about, which is what I'd call operating margin risk. what really is going to drop to the bottom line. But I believe in London. I think 4% going in on, I know the location. I don't want to go through the other investments. You'll have others talk about that. But in terms of why I chose that one, it worked for me.
Okay, thank you. The irony was we spoke the whole morning, I have the impression, about lithium-ion batteries, and Nadia, you ran out of battery with your microphone. Now that you are back on track, what was your choice, and can you just guide us through your thinking process?
Yeah, so my choice was the Seattle office. I mean, the cap rate is the highest here. We've got quite long lease to Amazon, so strong covenant again, and then relatively long, I think, to WeWork. As you highlighted, I'm very pleased to see that audience has highlighted market risk as one of the most important. I think we heard that rents have been accelerating in this market. Net absorption has been very healthy, so there's been a lot of demand for office space. So even if something would happen, I don't believe so, to Amazon or any of the tenants, I think there would be, another tenant, and that's what gives me a lot of confidence to vote for Seattle office in this case.
Okay, thank you. And then finally, obviously, Tony, would you want to give it a last pitch for your PRS? Obviously, Mark has done this beautifully, but can you just maybe add some other flavor from the investment management side?
Is this because you're the chairman, so you get the casting vote? Is that why you're asking that, trying to persuade you to change your mind? I think it's ultimately about the fundamentals of supply and demand. Ultimately, if you invest in real estate, you need people to occupy the space that you're renting. And you can't get better fundamentals in the London housing market for rentals, simple as that.
Jonathan Gray said it from Blackstone in his interview yesterday, buy growth.
Buy growth, yeah.
Right,
yeah. Okay. Now, with my casting vote, obviously, as chairman, I will follow the swarm intelligence here in the room at the World Built Environment Forum in London 2018. So we're gonna buy the Seattle asset, if that's okay with my dear colleagues. Sorry for the work all done in vain to prepare this. Yeah, it's always like this. You can not only win, sometimes the other one loses. And therefore, let me just maybe conclude. I know the chairman has the duty to start on time and finish on time. I've failed in both tasks, so I don't care. I'm told drinks are at 7 o'clock. Sean, why that gap? Anyway, that's potentially, should we overrun? So we have until 7 p.m. to... I see, okay. Well, when I was president, this was kind of drinks immediately, yeah. Anyway, so to round this up, we are meeting in 3 world regions, and we've done so for the last 2.5 years, and we discuss stuff which keeps us up at night. Now, I would like to do a final round and a brief statement, because we've discussed in these, dozens of meetings, so many risks, and obviously we've got representatives of the 3 investment risk forums in Europe, i.e. London, the Americas, New York, and Asia Pacific, Hong Kong or Singapore. Now, starting with Eric, what keeps us up at night, and what kind of motivates us to keep this initiative up, although the music is still playing, and although we don't see any sign of the black swan and that shock that could actually stop the music immediately, what is your concern and what drives you to continue work with RICS on the Investment Risk Forum?
Devaluation risk, I think, is probably one that keeps me up, and just taking a keen observation of the terminal assumptions in any of your investment underwriting.
Okay, devaluation risk. Russell?
Yeah, I guess my concern is the question about whether we're in a bubble or not. And I think there was a piece put out by a strategist from GMO, James Montier, a few weeks ago, which he described the current market, and everyone in the room mostly concerned about market risk, and he described the current market as a cynical bubble. The definition being that you keep putting money in even though you think it's heavily overpriced. And he was talking about the US equities market really, but I think there's a case that could be argued for that in the real estate markets globally. And a quote from The Big Short, which is one of my favorite books and movies of the moment, no one can see a bubble, that's what makes it a bubble.
This is the second quote I would It's not just the students in the room to take down. This is very philosophical here. Nadia, what keeps you up at night other than small children?
We talked quite a lot about alternative asset classes today and how institutional investors are moving into alternatives, so what we call alternatives, and operational risk connected to this. But I think that two main sectors that institutional investors have been investing in over time, offices and retail, are tremendously shifting and changing. And these are becoming much more operational in themselves, because we've got as main tenant today in London, WeWork. And that's completely different way of operating and managing that type of office buildings. Retail is just working if it's this experiential retail or convenience. So the two kind of mainstream sectors are completely changing, and require much more operational side of it if they're going to work, so to say.
Thank you, Nadia. Phil.
I think there's a tendency amongst investment people to focus on capital markets too much. So I'm going to pick obsolescence and the fact that we invest on behalf of our clients for the long term, and what is the building of the future right now with, as Nadia says, such a fast-changing way that people want to eat, sleep, drink and work. And are we really thinking about what that may be like in, 10 years, which, by the way, is our standard underwriting?
Thank you. Make me think. Mark.
I guess for me, because I have a conviction view that ultimately it won't be fundamentals that drive the turn in the cycle. It'll be sentiment, animal spirits, as they say. It's what is that unpredictable, issue that can drive that shift. And for me, what I do worry about is the social divisions. We talked about it in some of the earlier sessions across the globe, inequality and populism coming out of that, and how potentially at some point that leads to policy making that is a threat to economic growth, and that leads to a shift in sentiment, and that ultimately turns the cycle. So it's that connectivity, but fundamentally it's social issues reaching that boiling point that ultimately trump, terrible word.
You've said it, 10 quid into the...
Yeah, into the swear jar.
Yeah.
That surmount economic fundamentals.
More than the climate issues which we were talking about earlier. Lou, what is your kind of nightmare risk which keeps you up at night?
I think at where we are now in the current economy environment, I think it's quite important to keep alert on the market cycle risk. And as you mentioned at the beginning, and what we have experienced in the great financial crisis some time ago, and it's very likely, and people forget about the previous mistakes we have made, and we have to be always alert and knowing what the lessons we have learned previously, and be clear and looking at where we are at the market cycle, and recognize that and make sure you stick to your strategy rather than just following the market trend. I think that's quite important at this stage. And I may add another point. I think is very important is that sustainability is on the rise. It's more and more kind of crucial, especially for institutional investors, and because that has impact on our world environment, and for a long term, then I think it's important that we be a responsible investor and trying to build a more greener world together.
Thank you, Lou. Catherine.
I would say the cost of urbanization and whether it's sustainable. Everyone sees all the global gateway cities growing and becoming more densified and more people, which is great if you can afford to live in the city. But with the lack of affordability and lack of spending on transportation and infrastructure. I worry that at some point it is harder to get around, more complicated and expensive, and the talent that everyone is chasing needs to move out of the city. So I think we're starting to see, small urban areas in suburbia just outside the urban core, because they can move slightly further out and be affordable. And in the old days where the talent moved to where the employer was, it is the opposite now. So if the workers can't afford to live in these urban areas, then the employers are going to move slightly outside to attract them. And I think if you look at, we look at buying land all the time. There's very little land left in cities, that it becomes more and more expensive, which drives up the cost. Construction is more expensive. There's taller buildings, more density. So I think it's a challenge to say, how do urban environments grow in a sustainable fashion?
Thank you. And finally, last but not least, Tony.
Yes, I think, I guess at this stage of the cycle, the thing that keep me awake at night would be style drift. And by that I mean is by investors going off piste and investing in things they don't really understand in order to deliver returns that maybe aren't there. That's, in my mind, is the biggest risk, because it's very hard, it's a very competitive market, it's hard to find assets, and therefore the temptation is to go off piste where it's more risky, and that was a mistake in my view.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I think what this panel, this investment committee highlighted is that we're living in uncertain and volatile times, a theme that will be played on during these 2 days of the World Built Environment Forum. I tell my investors when they ask us to deploy huge amounts of capital, I tell them, if you want a guarantee, then the best thing would be to buy a washing machine. And not play with huge sums of capital in the current market conditions 10 years after GFC. What is also important is that all of us, the industry, people in this room, make sure that the experience, and we had the 250 years which I mentioned at the outset and which hopefully shines through somehow in the course of our debate, is passed on to the next generations, who in our offices has actually been through 4 cycles, like some of us have, who has actually been through the aftermath of a bubble bursting. And I think we should share this knowledge. We should try and learn from previous mistakes. The young generation, they are free to invent new mistakes, but try and avoid maybe the ones of their ancestors. And that's part and parcel of the philosophy of the RICS Investment Risk Forum, that is to share experiences, share best practice and knowledge about how to best shield our portfolios, our assets entrusted onto us by our investors against the vulnerabilities and the uncertainties in this market. And if we have managed to give you a little bit of insight into how we discuss things and how we rack our brains at times in terms of where and when and how to deploy other people's money, then I think we've achieved at least that modest goal. So thank you so much for your attention. You've been a wonderful audience, and I would suggest that we stay seated now, the panel, whilst James is going to do the chair summary and close off day 1. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you so much, Martin. It's the first time we said that the Summit has done a session like this, and I think it was absolutely brilliant. So to Martin and to his team, thank you very much for that $1 trillion question session. I don't think I've ever seen a room so full at the end of the day, but it's not quite the end of the day. We're going to ask you to choose a fringe meeting to go to. They start now, and they're in a couple of different rooms. There's a fringe meeting on avoiding conflicts in construction and infrastructure projects, and that's in the Cutty Sark room. There's a fringe meeting on professional regulation in the 4th Industrial Age, which is in Arcadia 2, and you can see that right behind you on the screen there for those details. Or if you're a rising star in that program, you've already been asked to go to your own session over there as well. Otherwise, we're going to see you at 7 p.m. for dinner right inside this room. This room's going to be transformed over the next hour or two. And here's a quick notice looking ahead to tomorrow, another fantastic program. There is a breakfast at 7:45 a.m. in the breakout room there. It's called Retention of Women in Property and Construction, but I've been told that you don't need to be a woman to be invited. Men are still welcome for now. And the first plenary will begin at 9 a.m. sharp over here. Quick word, please remember to bring your badges for security. And on your way out right now, please pick up a copy of Confidence, a journal which has just been created for this summit. Thank you very much and see you shortly.